My husband removed me from his private company, declaring, "Only 5 family members can stay. Outsiders must go." Unaware that I was the one behind the company's most profitable software, I simply said, "All right." Then, I took full control of the software and left. The next morning, he called me in a panic. "Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community." He slid the termination letter across the mahogany table, flanked by his mother Susan and my sister-in-law Kelsey. He looked smug, convinced he was simply cutting costs to increase their inheritance. I didn't offer a rebuttal. I didn't beg for a severance package. I just smiled, typed a single command code into my laptop, closed it, and walked out. The walk from the conference room to my office was the longest 40 seconds of my life. The hallway was silent, save for the low, expensive hum of the server room on my left, the nervous system of the entire company. Running would imply panic. Storming out would imply I cared. Instead, I walked with the steady, measured pace of someone who knows exactly where the bodies are buried because I was the one who dug the graves. I closed my office door and locked it. The sound of the latch clicking into place was the only punctuation I needed. I sat in my ergonomic chair, the one Brandon had bought me as an anniversary gift 3 years ago instead of a vacation. I woke up my computer. The screen glowed with the familiar blue dashboard of Apex One. Brandon saw this software as a money printer. Susan saw it as a status symbol. Kelsey saw it as magic. But I saw it for what it was: architecture. I opened the terminal window. My fingers moved across the mechanical keyboard, a rapid-fire staccato that felt more like a heartbeat than typing. I wasn't accessing the employee portal. I was logging into the root directory. You see, Brandon made a critical error in his greed. He assumed that because we were married, he owned my mind. He assumed that because I worked 18-hour days building this platform, it belonged to Apex Logistics. But he never read the fine print of the intellectual property agreement I had him sign 4 years ago, back when he was desperate and I was just trying to protect my late father's legacy. The software wasn't an asset of Apex Logistics. It was licensed property of Legacy Systems, LLC. A dormant entity solely owned by me. Brandon didn't own the engine. He was just leasing the car. I navigated to the licensing tab. There it was. Auto renew. Active. I hovered the cursor over the checkbox. For a moment, my hand froze. Not out of hesitation, but out of a sudden, crushing wave of clarity. I looked at the silver-framed photo on my desk. It was a picture of my father and me, taken the day I graduated with my master's in computer science. He died 3 months later. That was the invisible chain that had bound me to Brandon for so long. Grief is a heavy coat, and when my father died, I was so cold, so desperate for a place to belong, that I mistook Brandon's neediness for love. I mistook Susan's demands for inclusion. I thought that if I could just make myself indispensable, if I could build them a kingdom, they would finally let me into the castle. I thought value was the price of admission to a family. I had spent years trying to earn my place at their table, overdrawing my own soul to pay for their approval. I realized now that I hadn't been a partner to them. I had been a resource, a battery to be drained until it was dry, then discarded. But I wasn't dry yet. I clicked the mouse. Auto renew. Disabled. A small dialog box appeared. Warning: license will expire at midnight local time. System shutdown imminent. Proceed? I typed YES. The command line blinked once, accepting the order. The digital time bomb was set. At midnight, the code that routed $12 million worth of global freight would simply stop existing. Scorched earth is a tactic for people who have nothing to lose. I had everything to protect. So, I didn't wipe the servers or delete the data. I simply revoked the access they stopped paying for the moment they fired me. I placed the photo of my father into my tote bag. It was the only thing I took. I left the laptop open, the screen still glowing, the cursor blinking rhythmically. Let them think business was proceeding as usual. Let them enjoy their victory lap. I walked out of the building, past the security guard who nodded at me, completely unaware that I had just turned the entire company into a pumpkin. The drive to the apartment I had rented 2 weeks ago, a sterile, quiet one-bedroom on the other side of Chicago, was a blur. The radio stayed off. Tears were a luxury I couldn't afford. I drove in silence, letting the adrenaline metabolize into a cold, hard resolve. I thought about the last 3 years, the 80-hour weeks, the missed birthdays, the way Brandon would stand on stage at industry conferences, accepting awards for visionary leadership, while I sat in the back row, exhausted, debugging the very code he was bragging about. He called me his secret weapon. I should have realized that weapons are tools, not people. When I arrived at the apartment, I didn't unpack. I set up my war room. 3 monitors, a secure VPN, a pot of black coffee. I spent the next few hours building my defense. I wasn't just sitting around waiting for the explosion. I was fortifying the blast zone. I drafted a timeline of the software's development dates, timestamps, Git commits, proving that the core architecture was built 6 months before I even met Brandon. I remembered the night I finished the prototype. My father was already in the hospital. I showed him the interface on my laptop, and he smiled through the oxygen mask. "Smart girl," he whispered. "Keep it yours." I had tried, but then he died, and the silence was so loud I would have done anything to fill it. Brandon filled it with noise and chaos and needs. He needed me. And for a while, that felt enough like love. But love doesn't ask you to sign over your intellectual property. Love doesn't ask you to make yourself smaller so someone else can feel big. By 10 o'clock at night, my phone was silent. They were probably at the victory dinner now. I could almost picture it. Susan would be holding court, talking about how refreshing it would be to have a real family member running marketing. Kelsey would be scrolling through TikTok, already bored with her new title. Brandon would be opening a bottle of the good stuff, probably a vintage Cabernet, paid for by the third-quarter earnings of the software he just tried to steal. He had no idea. I imagined him explaining to Kelsey how the system worked. "It basically runs itself," he'd say, waving a hand dismissively. "Coding is just typing, really." Savannah made it sound complicated to justify her salary. That was the Dunning-Kruger effect in action. He was too incompetent to understand the scope of his own incompetence. He thought he could replace a lead architect with a marketing intern because he lacked the knowledge to know the difference between a user interface and a back-end server. He saw the shiny buttons. I saw the millions of lines of code underneath that kept the world moving. I checked the time. 11:45. 15 minutes until midnight. I opened a new window on my screen. The remote admin panel for the server hosting. It showed the system health. Green lights across the board, bandwidth stable, CPU usage normal. For now, to understand why I was so calm as I watched the status lights die on my monitor, you have to understand where I was 3 hours before I initiated the shutdown. I wasn't just crying in my car. I was building a paper shield. I was sitting in a vinyl booth at the Night Owl, a 24-hour diner, 3 blocks from the office. Across from me sat Marcus, my father's oldest friend, and the city's most ruthless intellectual property attorney. He wasn't drinking coffee, he was drinking the blood in the water. He flipped through the document I had slid across the table, the original end-user license agreement Brandon had signed 4 years ago. Brandon had signed it without reading it, too busy picking out the color of his CEO chair to worry about the fine print. "This is ironclad, Savannah," Marcus said, tapping paragraph 14, subsection B. "You didn't structure this as work for hire. You structured it as a vendor relationship. Legacy Systems LLC provides a service to Apex Logistics. If the client terminates the relationship, which Brandon just did, in writing, with that termination letter, the license revokes immediately." "He thinks he owns the code, Marcus," I said, dipping a fry into a milkshake. "He thinks because we're married. It's marital property." Marcus smiled, a shark-like expression that made me feel safer than I had in years. "That's the beauty of it. You built the core architecture before the marriage, you incorporated the LLC before the marriage, and you licensed it to his company. He didn't fire his wife, Savannah. He fired his software provider." He pulled a second file from his briefcase. "This was the weapon I hadn't expected. But there is something else. Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave. I pulled the uniform commercial code filings on Apex this afternoon. Brandon took out a $4 million line of credit last month to renovate the offices and put Kelsey on the payroll. I know, I said. He told the board it was for expansion. He secured the loan using the software's intellectual property as collateral, Marcus said. The air left my lungs. He what? He listed the source code as a company asset on the loan application. He pledged property he doesn't own to a federally insured bank. Marcus closed the folder. That isn't just a contract dispute, Savannah. That is bank fraud. The moment you revoke that license, the bank's collateral vanishes. His loan goes into immediate default. He won't just be bankrupt, he'll be criminally liable. I stared at the neon sign buzzing in the window. I had come here looking for leverage. I had found a nuclear launch code. Draft the cease and desist, I said. And the notice of license termination. I want them in his inbox at 8 in the morning. Marcus slid a pen across the table. One more thing. Block his number on your personal phone. Right now. From this moment on, you are not his wife. You are the CEO of a hostile vendor. Force him to call the business line. Make it transactional. I took my phone out. I scrolled to husband. I didn't hesitate. I hit block. Back in my apartment. The clock read 12:30 in the morning. The silence in my war room was heavy, but on the screens, the chaos was visible in the data. At the stroke of midnight, the world didn't end, but Brandon's world certainly did. I wasn't there to see it, but I didn't need to be. I wrote the code. I knew exactly what the death of the system looked like. It starts in the server room. The cooling fans, which usually hum at a steady, reassuring drone, spin down. The status lights on the racks shift from a solid, healthy green to a blinking, angry red. And then, silence. At the distribution hubs in Memphis and Louisville, the silence was broken by confusion. Conveyor belts stopped. Scanners beeped error codes. Thousands of packages, destined for Amazon and FedEx, sat frozen on the belts because the routing algorithms that told them where to go had simply evaporated. The digital map was gone. Brandon was likely asleep, dreaming of his new life as the sole owner of my hard work. But at 12:05, his phone would have started vibrating against the nightstand. It wouldn't stop. First, the night operations manager, then the VP of logistics. Then the angry automated alerts from the client portals. I poured myself another coffee and watched the error logs cascade down my screen like a waterfall. Database connection refused. License key invalid. Critical system failure. By 1 in the morning, Brandon would have been in his car, speeding toward the office, probably screaming at Kelsey on the phone. I imagined the scene. Kelsey, the new head of innovation, standing in the server room in her pajamas, staring at the blinking red lights, realizing that her degree in fashion marketing hadn't prepared her to reboot a proprietary enterprise logistics kernel. They would try the obvious fixes first. They would restart the servers. Nothing. They would try to bypass the license check. Impossible. Then, Brandon would play his ace card, or what he thought was his ace. He would go to the physical safe in his office and pull out the emergency backup hard drives. He had made a copy of the source code 6 months ago, just in case. He thought he was clever. He would plug the drive in. The prompt would appear. Enter decryption key. He didn't have the key. I carried the key in my head. It was a 24-character string based on the GPS coordinates of my father's grave. Without it, that backup drive was just an expensive paperweight. But the real twist, the one that turned this from a disaster into a tragedy, happened at 3 in the morning. My banking alert pinged. It wasn't a deposit. It was a status change on the Apex Logistics corporate accounts. Account status: frozen. Reason: collateral deficiency. The bank's automated risk algorithms were faster than human panic. When the software license expired, the valuation of Apex Logistics dropped from $12 million to the value of the used office furniture. The bank had issued an immediate margin call. Brandon hadn't just lost the ability to ship packages. He had lost access to every dime the company had. He couldn't pay the drivers. He couldn't pay the lease. He couldn't even buy a cup of coffee to keep himself awake for the nightmare that was coming. He had signed loan documents swearing he owned the intellectual property. Now, the bank knew he didn't. He was staring at a screen that didn't just say error, it said fraud. I closed my laptop. The sun was starting to bleed through the blinds, painting the room in shades of gray and gold. The silence in my apartment was peaceful. The silence in Brandon's office was expensive. I unblocked his number on my business line, set the phone on the table, and waited. The call came at 7:02 in the morning. I was sitting on my balcony, watching the city wake up. The steam from my coffee curled into the cool air, vanishing like a ghost. When my work phone buzzed on the glass table, I didn't jump. I didn't reach for it desperately. I took another sip of coffee, let it ring 3 times, and then tapped the green icon. I put it on speaker. Brandon's voice filled the quiet morning air, but it wasn't the smooth, arrogant baritone he used in board meetings. It was a high-pitched, ragged sound, like an animal caught in a trap. He wasn't speaking. He was hyperventilating syllables. He was screaming about Amazon lawyers, about breach of contract, about FedEx trucks idling in parking lots costing the company $10,000 a minute. I listened for a full minute without saying a word. I just listened to the sound of a man realizing his parachute was actually a backpack full of rocks. When he finally stopped to inhale, I spoke. My voice was calm, almost bored. I asked him who was calling. He screamed that it was my husband. He screamed that I needed to stop this childish prank immediately or he would call the police. He tried to pivot back to the gaslighting tactics that had worked for 3 years. He told me I was being dramatic. He told me I was hysterical. He told me I was ruining the family legacy. I interrupted him. I told him he wasn't speaking to his wife. I told him he was speaking to the CEO of Legacy Systems, a vendor he had terminated with cause 24 hours ago. There was a silence on the line, thick and heavy. Then, he tried to play the power card. He yelled that he was the CEO of Apex Logistics, that he owned the building, the trucks, and the contracts. He demanded I turn the servers back on because he was the one in charge. That was the moment I delivered the truth he had been too blind to see. I explained to him the illusion of power he had been living under. It's a concept called the illusion of the empty wallet. Brandon had spent his entire life believing that the wallet, the title, the corner office, the expensive suit, the company letterhead was where the power lived. He thought if he held the wallet, he held the wealth. But he didn't understand that a wallet is just a container. It is leather and stitching. The true power is the currency inside the competence, the skill, the intellectual property. For 3 years, I had been the currency filling his empty wallet. I was the value, he was just the packaging. And now that he had thrown the currency away to make room for his mother and sister, he was left holding nothing but an expensive piece of leather. He had position power, but I had competence power. And in the real world, competence always eats position for breakfast. I heard his breathing hitch. He understood. For the first time, he realized that without me, he wasn't a CEO. He was just a man in a nice suit, standing in a burning building. His tone shifted instantly. He started begging. He offered me a raise. He offered to fire Kelsey. He offered to put my name on the website. I let him finish. Then I gave him the number. I told him that since he had terminated our previous contract, we would need to negotiate a new one. Emergency reconnection services operated at a premium. The fee to restore the license key was $250,000, wired immediately, and the new monthly licensing fee would be triple the previous rate, with a 5-year guarantee. He choked. He said he didn't have that kind of cash liquid. He said the accounts were frozen. I told him that sounded like a personal problem. I told him he had 1 hour to wire the funds before the data purge began. Then I hung up, picked up my coffee, and watched the sun continue to rise. Brandon never wired the money. He couldn't. The bank had already moved from freezing the accounts to seizing the assets. At 9 in the morning, the data purge began. But I didn't let the code die. I simply transferred ownership. I spent the next hour on a conference call with Apex's largest competitor, a global conglomerate that had been trying to replicate my architecture for years. By noon, I had signed an acquisition deal. I sold the exclusive rights to the legacy system's source code for $18 million. They bought the tech, but they had no interest in the shell company that had been leasing it. Apex Logistics didn't just close, it evaporated. The liquidation was brutal. The glass-walled office, the mahogany tables, the ergonomic chairs, it was all auctioned off to pay creditors. Susan and Kelsey didn't just lose their imaginary executive titles, they lost their audience. Without the money to fund their lifestyle, the social circle they worshipped quietly uninvited them. They were left with nothing but a family legacy that turned out to be a leased narrative. Brandon fared worse. The bank didn't take kindly to being lied to about collateral. He is currently facing federal charges for wire fraud and loan application falsification. He wanted to be a man of consequence. Now, he finally is. A month later, I visited the cemetery. The grass was green, the air crisp. I placed a copy of the acquisition contract on my father's headstone. "We protected the house, Dad," I whispered. "It's ours again." I didn't keep all the money. I used it to seed a new venture capital firm dedicated to funding female tech founders, women who are the architects of their own value, who just need someone to back them before they get drained by the parasites of the world. I sat on a bench near the gate and pulled out my phone. Husband. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad. I felt the same way I felt when I closed a terminal window after a successful compile. The job was done. The errors were resolved. I tapped delete. Then I stood up, walked to my car, and drove into a future that finally belonged to me. If you believe in knowing your own worth, hit that like button and share this story. And if you've ever had to walk away to save yourself, tell me I walked in the comments. See you in the next one.